Since the last time I was here, I think Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh died. Let's see if that fixes it. I was speaking somewhere else where my glasses kept clicking with the microphone thing. So that. Okay. So I can't see you now. You're still here, right? All right. So anyway, Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh passed away right around the time of the Lunar New Year, and probably most of you know who he was, but in case you don't, he was a Vietnamese, very highly revered Vietnamese Zen master who became very well known all over the world because of his work to try to eliminate war, generally, work toward peace. It started out as trying to raise awareness of the suffering that was being experienced in Vietnam at the time, which was actually before the U.S. got involved in the war in Vietnam. But because of his work in engaged Buddhism, which is a term that he coined, he's probably next to the Dalai Lama, the second best known Buddhist in the world. And he passed away just a few weeks ago. And around the time he died, or shortly after he died, I started seeing this meme online, popping up in various places, Facebook and LinkedIn and everywhere else that you go in social media. And it was, sort of in his script, his brushstrokes. It said, "No mud, no lotus. No mud, no lotus." And so I was looking at it, and I was looking at some of the people who were posting it, some of the places it was appearing, and I started wondering, what does it mean to people? Why is this particularly resonating with people? And so that they're wanting to share this idea with others. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to look at what this means, because it can mean different things. And so I thought I would just kind of jam on this idea a little bit. No mud, no lotus. And actually, first thing I did was I tried to figure out if Thich Nhat Hanh actually said it, because, you see something showing up on the internet attributed to somebody, and, there's about a 50-50 chance that they didn't say it. But it happens to have been a title of a book that he wrote, and that was published like 2014 or something like that. So fairly recent. I haven't read it, so I'm going to talk about it, but I haven't read it. But the subtitle of the book is The Art of Transforming Suffering. And I read a blurb about it on one of the bookstore sites, and it says something like, "The secret to happiness is to acknowledge and transform suffering, not to run away from it." So I thought that was kind of interesting. One of the notes that I read on it talks about how in the book, Thich Nhat Hanh says the problem is not that we suffer, it's that we don't know how. And so it is an instructional on how to suffer, not just how to suffer. I mean, everybody knows how to hit yourself on the thumb with a hammer and, what to say when that happens. But how can you suffer skillfully in a way that doesn't avoid it, that doesn't push it away or cling to it or make a storyline about it, that can help you transcend it or accept it, and to make use of it in your spiritual life, whatever that means to you. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. That's a very useful thing to do. And it reminded me of something that I got in a newsletter recently. I get newsletters from chaplaincy organizations and stuff like that. And it was talking about how these young people these days, are stressed over the pressure to be happy. And I thought, you know what, I get that, because I work with a lot of young people, being a university chaplain, and we do, and I don't think it's unique to young people. I think that in our society, we have this idea that the objective of life is to be happy. In fact, you'll hear pretty smart people like the Dalai Lama say everybody wants to be happy. And then this goal of happiness becomes in itself a source of unhappiness. In reality, happiness, what we think of as happiness is what we mean when we say happiness is kind of elusive, and it can be a little bit vague and means different things in different contexts and to different people. And so, what is it? It's not going around feeling good all the time. It's not getting everything that you want. It's not, it's not suffering. I know it seems weird, but there's a Twilight Zone episode that I love. It's called The Other Place, and this guy in this episode, this man has suddenly awakened in an unfamiliar apartment, and it turns out that he was a petty criminal, and he had gotten killed robbing a bank or something like that. And so he was reborn. He reappeared in this apartment that was actually very nice, and he had a butler to look after his needs and all this kind of stuff. And so he said, he's talking to the butler and trying to figure out what's going on, and he says, I'm a little hungry, and the butler goes, oh, okay, well, there's your favorite food right there. And so all he's got to do is ask for something, and he gets it. And so he gets favorite food, he gets a little bored, the butler goes, well, you got a sports car right out front, you can go out to the nightclubs. And so he goes out to the nightclubs, and whenever he gambles, he wins. The women are all beautiful, and they're all in love with him. All of these things, whatever he wants, he's got it. And he's very confused because he's going, I didn't do anything good in life that I can recall. He's racking his brain. What did I do to deserve this? And so the angel takes him to the Hall of Records, where he looks all through the record of his life. He goes, there's nothing here. I was just a really bad guy. Why do I have everything I want? So after a while, he starts getting really bored. Gambling's not fun when you win all the time. When every band in every nightclub only plays your favorite songs, they stop being your favorite songs. And so he goes to this guy, to the butler, and he goes, look, can you help me get to the other place? The butler goes, what do you mean? He says, well, I just don't think I'm suited out for this heaven thing. And the butler goes, what makes you think you're in heaven? This is the other place. It's beautiful. If you get a chance, I'm sure it's out there on one of the streaming services somewhere. So happiness is only possible if we accept that part of living a happy life is going to include some times when we're not getting everything we want. It's going to include some times that we don't feel good, maybe even include some times that we have to experience some things that are pretty unpleasant. So let's look at the text here. No mud, no lotus. So lotus is a symbol of Buddhism. It goes back to when the Buddha first was enlightened. He was kind of in a quandary about whether or not to teach. And because he realized that what he had awakened to was very, very profound. And he didn't know if people would understand it. And he awakened as a result of doing certain things that were going to be challenging, and he didn't know if people would do them. And so he thought, well, maybe there's no point in even talking to people about this. Maybe I should just go off and be what they called a Pachaka Buddha. This was a Buddha who had awakened but didn't teach and didn't share it. He spent about a week kind of meditating on this stuff at the shore of the river where he had become enlightened. And he was sitting there one day and he saw these lotuses. And so lotuses, in case you don't know, it's a water plant. Beautiful, brilliant blossoms. And he was looking at these lotuses and he realized that some lotuses stayed mired down in the mud. They grow, in ponds and riverbanks and things like that. And they really grow in places there's pretty thick, very fertile mud. And some of them never really got out of the mud. And some of them would rise just to the surface of the water, and they'd make they'd make these little lotus paths and stuff, the foliage floating on the water, but that's as far as they would get. And some of them would rise all the way up into the sunlight and bloom. And he realized that some people were like this, that some of them were just, no matter what you did or said, they would stay mired in the mud. Some would make some progress. Some would make it to the first or second or maybe even the third path toward awakening, and some would completely transcend their human suffering and become fully awakened like him. So, what is mud? What is lotus? The mud, obviously, is the state of ordinary human existence, which the first noble truth in Buddhism says is inherently stressful. So without a place of stressfulness, we don't go anywhere. We're rooted in the mud if we don't see that we're in the mud, and if we don't develop the desire to rise above it. So without the mud, there's no desire to go anywhere. We are, if we choose to, rise out of the mud completely and not be stained by it. Even though our roots are sunk deep into the muck of existence, there's a part of us that can come out and open up and not be touched by that. And so we talk about the natural human state of Buddha nature, which is unstained by the kind of stuff that you get all over you if you're down in the mud. So there's this term in Buddhism that I kind of hate. It's defilements. It means the residue of unskillful karma that clings to the mind and keeps us from seeing clearly. And so the lotus is not free from that completely, but it arises out of that. From the muck of the river bottom, the muck of existence in the what we call the Saha world, the world that we're in, the world of coming and glowing, blooms into the light without showing any stains from the mud. So rising from the mud but not stained by it. So what does this have to do with this idea of how to suffer? It's kind of an interesting way of looking at this. So suffering is inevitable. The Buddha talked about three kinds. First, there's pain. There's the stress of that which is naturally painful. Birth, illness, aging, dying. Those things are inherently stressful. And there are circumstances that are inherently difficult. I start talking about this sometimes, and people will say, well, what about people suffering from war? That's not just all in your mind. No, it's not. There are circumstances that are inherently difficult. There's the stress that happens because of inconstancy, the suffering of change. The new car gets scratched. The new job becomes less interesting, and so on. And then there's the stress that the mind fabricates. Like when you're meditating and your mind creates restlessness, or when you get angry and say things that you later regret, or when a worry arises and then you, instead of just letting it go, you decide you're going to worry about it until you make yourself really anxious. That's the stress of fabrication, the suffering that we create as the result of the way our minds engage with reality. So they're actually kind of important to our existence. The change one is kind of interesting because sometimes circumstances change, sometimes things change, sometimes our feelings around things change. When I used to work in Maitland, in a big office in Maitland Center. And there was a tenant I'm not going to name because this is going to go online. I don't want to get sued. But they had the whole floor, the 5th floor of this building that I was in. And their CEO would come in from another state and be there for a while. And he drove the most beautiful car I have ever seen. So this was in the 80s, and it was like Miami Vice days. And remember Ferrari Testarossas? You ever see one of those? It was one of those, and it was lipstick red. It was gorgeous. And he loved that car. He loved it so much that when he parked diagonally across 2 disabled parking spaces because he was afraid of somebody dinging it. So this is part of the suffering of change. Inevitably, no matter how beautiful your car is, eventually your feelings around it are going to change. Eventually, it's going to get pinged by, gravel on the road or something like that. It's going to start to deteriorate a little bit. Sooner or later, you're just going to get bored with it. You're going to want a different Ferrari or a Bugatti or a Bentley or something like that. I'd be happy just to have a Toyota. Anyway, so the mind does this, and it probably helps us exist in some ways. If there was if you were hungry and you went to a restaurant and they said, "Oh, sorry, we're completely out of food," and you didn't react to that in kind of a negative way with a bad feeling, then you wouldn't go anywhere else. Oh, well, I guess I'm not going to eat today, and you'd be okay with that. So sometimes not getting what we want and reacting in a way that involves stress is actually good for us. So without something to transcend, there is no transcendence. Without the mud, there is nothing to move us toward a happier place. And so part of being happy is to understand that unhappiness is a part of that it's not always going to be free from suffering. So there's another level where no mud, no lotus comes into play. Once a week or so, I'm at a Buddhist service somewhere where we chant the Heart Sutra. It's a very famous sutra that lots of Mahayana Buddhists chant. And it's about emptiness. But it's also about interdependence. And if you've ever read Thich Nhat Hanh, you can't get very far without coming across the word interdependent. So I'm going to try to this emptiness is a great big teaching that takes a long time to explain and even longer to understand. So I'll try to make it really kind of pare it down to what's useful. So the sutra says all things are expressions of emptiness, not stained, not pure, neither waxing nor waning, and so on. And it says if you understand emptiness, then you understand how to free yourself from fear, from difficulties. So I happen to have this bottle of water here. So if I guzzled the rest of the water in this, I could say this bottle is empty. And if you were a smart person who was prone to arguing with people like me, you'd say, no, it's not empty, it's got air in it. So theoretically, we could put it in a vacuum chamber, we could suck all the air out. I could say, well, now it's empty. And you could say, no, it's still got, it doesn't exist without having something in it. It's got to have the plastic that keeps it together. It's got shape and form. It's got purpose. It's not empty of a lot of things. There's a lot of things that are in this. So when we're saying emptiness, we mean empty of what? What is it empty of? And so when he's talking about emptiness of a separate, discrete self, something that defines it in a way that's really tangible and that is permanent and enduring and that's always there. So when we realize that nothing is really independent of everything else, then the realization of emptiness becomes the realization of oneness. So if we lose the self, we gain a relationship with the more, which is the term William James came up with. What is beyond me? So when I realize that me is connected to everything else, then I recognize that me is the more. Does that make sense? So this is a little different conversation, but there's a thing called sanctification theory, which is about what makes something sacred. And so it's really this moment where you recognize the more that is not just me but beyond me, and my relationship to it are one. Zen Master Dogen, who founded Soto Zen, said to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, to lose the self. And to forget the self is to be actualized by everything. So that sounds really kind of, airy-fairy maybe. I don't know how you would describe it. But think about it. If you've ever been doing something really with total commitment. I was talking to a group of musicians at Stetson about this the other day, and I said, when you play in music, do you forget you're there sometimes? You ever feel like you're being played by the music? Everybody said, yeah. Feels good. Yeah. Gardeners can experience this. Bicyclists can experience this. When you're really doing something where you forget that you're there, that's that moment when you can touch oneness.
So when you experience that, that because things are empty, they are interdependent, then your separation from them and them as a cause of suffering changes. So when you understand interdependence, everything includes everything. There's no waves without the ocean. You can't separate the ocean from its waves. This, this is a piece of paper. It's also a tree. It's also sunshine. It's also rain. It's also the intention somebody had to make it. It's also the words that I put on it. It's the thoughts that I had while I was putting this all together. This could not exist without all of those things. And all of those things could not exist without everything else. So I know this is a lot to absorb in one Sunday morning, but bring it down to earth, and well, I'll tell you another story that might help you. So these two monks were arguing. So that back in this was ancient China, and they were going into the Dharma hall because there was a flag outside the Dharma hall that was waving in the wind. And when the teacher was going to go in and give a talk, a Dharma talk, they would raise this flag, and so the monks would see it and they would come listen to the talk. So these monks are arguing, and one says, "Oh, look, the flag is moving." And the other monk goes, "No, the flag's not moving, the wind is moving." Okay. And so they're arguing over this. Now, both of these actually are pretty valid things to argue about, if you want to argue. One is the context what's important, or is the result of the context important? Is the wind the key thing, or is the movement of the flag the key thing? So Huining comes along. Huining is the 6th patriarch of Buddhism. He's very famous. And he listens to the monks argue a little bit, and then he says, "Shut up. No flag, no wind. Mind is moving." Okay? So in other words, it doesn't matter unless you're engaging your mind with what's going on. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This became a very famous story, and there are a lot of monks going around talking about this, and so two of them were telling, or one of them was telling some other monks this in a monastery, and everybody was all awestruck by how smart Huining was. And this nun comes along, and she's listening to it, and she goes, "No wind, no flag, no mind," and walks away. And this becomes the final word on this. When you start to make these distinctions between what is going on, how am I perceiving it, am I judging it, and all that kind of stuff, then you're creating all these sort of dualistic ideas. And when you transcend all of that, that's the experience of oneness. That's enlightenment. And so that's what she was talking about. So all these, so in a way, this brings us back to mud and lotus. Without mind, there's no mud. Without mind, there's no lotus. Without mind, who cares? So there is mud. There is lotus. It just kind of depends on where you're looking from. So thinking about things like the war that's happening right now. At a different time on a different day, I might say that our suffering is primarily the result of how our mind engages with what's going on, and that's true. But when we accept that life is going to change, the vicissitudes of life, and sometimes these are difficult moments, and sometimes we're called upon to do something different, then that's kind of the first step toward realization. If I were in Kiev right now, I don't know where I'd be. I might be standing in the street with a gun in my hand. That might be the appropriate thing to be doing. What's important about this is to be aware that as human beings, our role is to live authentically, which means look at our perceptions, wind, flag, mind, and then look at our purpose, listening to a Dharma talk. standing in the street in front of the barricades? What is our purpose? Get the judgments out of the way and live a good, authentic life. So thank you for your attention.